Happy Friday. Hey, this is the 6th time I'm going to start this video. I get it started, and then I make a mistake or say something wrong, and I stop it. So, I'm not stopping it this time. If there's a mistake, we're moving on. I want to tell you thank you. Correct spelling has improved. Yay! You're going back in the book. One thing to think about is that proper names such as Tom or Betsy, they need to be capitalized in order for them to be considered properly spelled. One of the questions I've looked at was, why is Betsy's grandfather not fighting? Answer is, he's too old. Which two is that? T-O, T-O-O, or T-W-O? It's the T-O-O. I didn't grade it wrong if you used the wrong two, but I want you to think about words as you're typing them and try not to misspell some simple words. Hi, but great job. Huge improvement. Thank you, thank you, thank you again. So we're going to look at page 59 in My Brother Sam is Dead. Tim has just ran to Tom Morris to get Sam, but actually technically not to get Sam, but to get Brown Bess, because he wants to take Brown Bess because the Continental soldiers have come to Father and want the gun, and Tim's afraid that they're going to hurt Father. So we've got Sam who's ran after Tim because he took the gun, and now Sam and Tim are standing there having a disagreement. So, page 59. It impressed me the casual, easy way he did it. Did you ever kill anybody, Sam? He looked embarrassed again. We haven't done any fighting yet. We set off across the snowfields, uphill and down, the way I'd come. Sam set a pretty good pace. He was hard and strong and used to it, from all the marching he'd done, and I had a hard time keeping up. But I was glad to go fast because I was so worried about Father. In 15 minutes, we came to our road, crossed it, and circled around back of the house. We ducked into the barn and stared at the tavern. There was smoke coming out of the chimney, but that was all. No sounds, no sign of men, no horses. Nothing happening, Sam said. Come on in with me and see, I said. It's risky, Tim. There's nobody around, I said. He stared at me. We both knew it was his job to go in because he was the older brother. All right, he said. Let's go. We darted across the barnyard and into the kitchen. And all of a sudden, there was Father standing there, the line of blood drying on his face. He and Sam stood 5 feet apart, staring at each other. Then Sam turned and ran. Sam! Father shouted. Come back, Sam! But Sam raced across the barnyard and then began pounding over the snowy field toward the woodlot, the Brown Bess under his arm. Father and I ran out into the barnyard and watched him go. Father knew he couldn't catch Sam. We watched him until he got to the stone wall at the edge of our pasture. He jumped up on it and stood there looking back at us. Then suddenly he waved, jumped down from the wall, and disappeared into the woodlot. Chapter 5. Up to that time, the war hadn't been very real. I mean, I knew it was going on because of the stories in the Connecticut Journal and from tales we heard in the tavern. Stories travelers would tell us about somebody being killed or suddenly coming across some fresh bodies in a field. One man who stopped with us had been at the Battle of Lexington and had been wounded in the knee there. He walked with a limp, and he had the ball that wounded him on a string around his neck. And of course Sam wasn't the only one from Reading who joined the militia. There were others, and every once in a while you'd hear about this one or that one having been in a battle, and maybe having been killed or wounded. But none of them were people I really knew, and so the war had always seemed to me like a story, something that happened in some faraway place or faraway time, and didn't have anything to do with me. But after the search for weapons, I had a different feeling about it. It was real, and it could come home to me too. Luckily, the troops hadn't really hurt anybody. Few of the men who'd put up a fuss like Father had got punched around a little, and Father had that cut which left a very thin scar you could hardly see. But even if nobody had got hurt, the people in Reading were good and angry about losing so many of their guns. Guns were valuable. It wasn't so much a matter of hunting. There wasn't too much game around, although some farmers occasionally got a deer or a muskrat for the pot. Most people wanted guns to go after the wolves that sometimes came down into the pastures after lambs, and for general protection. The worst part of it was that food was already beginning to get short. Army commissary officers, like the one Sam was working for, were buying up a lot of the livestock to feed the troops. Sometimes soldiers would just take a couple of cows out of somebody's fields without paying for them too. Both sides did it, the Patriots and the Tories. They weren't supposed to. They were always supposed to pay. But a lot of the time, at the end of a day's march, they'd find that there wasn't anything for them to eat. And they'd just go into a field, butcher a couple of cows, cut them up, and carry them off to camp on their shoulders. It was a terrible thing to lose your milking cows, because it meant no more milk or butter or cheese. There wasn't anything anyone could do about it, though. Oh, whenever it happened, the people would get up a petition and complain, but it never did much good because the soldiers were gone and the beef was eaten. By January of 1776, food was getting to be a real problem for us, too. It wasn't so much that we were going hungry, but that the meat and flour and rum and beer and everything else we needed to run the tavern and the store kept going up and up in price all the time. This forced us to raise our prices. Then prices would go up again, and we'd have to raise them some more. Still, the worst part of the war was missing Sam. Of course, he'd been gone at college before, so I'd got used to the idea of having to do his share of the work and all that. But when he was at Yale, I didn't have to worry about him all the time, worry that he'd be shot or get sick and die or something else. Although, to tell the truth, I envied him, too. I could picture him in my mind standing on top of the stone wall by the woodlot, the brown Bess cradled under his arm, waving at us. He seemed so brave and grown up, and I wished that I could be brave and grown up like him, too. I didn't like the idea of being shot at or wounded or killed very much, but it seemed to me that it must feel wonderful to be able to load up a gun in the casual way he did it. He knew that to a younger brother, everything your older brother does seems wonderful. I remember being little and watching Sam milk old Prue and admiring him and thinking how clever he was. And then it got to be my turn to learn how to milk old Prue, and I found out there wasn't any glory to it. It was just hard work and made your hands ache. So I guess that being a soldier probably didn't have much glory to it either. It was mostly just a lot of hard work. But still, I envied Sam, and I wished I were old enough to do something glorious, too. So time passed, and the war went on. Sometimes we'd read about Patriot victories, and other times about Tory victories, and all seemed confused. It was hard to tell who was really winning, partly because sometimes both sides claimed to have won the same battle. Father said, "The rebels are dang fools. How can they expect to beat the whole British army? They could win these skirmishes in the woods, but as soon as the British catch them in the pitched battles, they'll be done for, and no good can come out of it but a lot of men dead." Sometimes Patriot militiamen would come through Reading, and usually the officers would come into the tavern for a mug of beer. But they never bothered anybody. They just went away again. I'd stand at the door and watch them go, and I wondered, if I went for a soldier, which army would I join? The British had the best uniforms and the shiny new guns. There was something exciting about the Patriots, being underdogs and fighting off the mighty British army. So it became spring, and one April morning in 1776, Mr. Heron came into the tavern with Tom Morris. There was a soft rain falling and a fire burning in the fireplace. Father was rushing a chair seat, and I was helping him. It all seemed warm and cozy. Father stopped his work. "Good morning, Mr. Heron," he said. Father was always polite to Mr. Heron. He'd been to Trinity College in Dublin, and he was a surveyor. He'd been elected to the General Assembly in Hartford, but he'd been pushed out of it by the Patriots, being a Tory. He was rich, too, although nobody knew where he got his money from. He owned a black man, and he had other servants besides. "Good morning, Life," he said to Father. Then he noticed me. "Good morning, Tim." "Good morning, sir," I said. Wife, you've got a smart boy there. Smart as Sam if he wanted to be. I hope he's going on with school. My father shrugged. I'd like him to, but I can't spare him from here to every day. Mr. Heron may have wanted me to go on with my schooling, but I wasn't so sure of it myself. Figured I was as smart as Sam, but I didn't have as much interest in school as he had. I liked ciphering all right, but I didn't care much for spelling and studying the Bible and memorizing Psalms. Oh, Sam's smarter than I am, sir, I said, just to be modest. I like to see him in school when I can, Father said, but I need him here a good deal. I can't run the tavern without him. Still, it's a shame to waste talent. I could make a surveyor out of him if he'd apply himself. Perhaps I might take him on as an apprentice in a year or two, once he's learned to cipher. Being a surveyor was a good thing. You could make a lot of money. Father said that surveyors always knew about the good deals on land and could get rich speculating. So that part of it sounded good. But I wasn't so sure about all that studying. I don't know if I'm smart enough, I said, mostly to be modest again. Certainly you are, Tim. He sat down at the long table. Tim, how about getting me a pint of beer? And one for Tom, too. Tom Morups did spare work for Mr. Heron. Sometimes he ran messages for him, too. He didn't sit because he was only an Indian, but stood leaning against the wall. I got mugs down from the shelf and filled them and served them around, including one for Father. He sat down at the table, too, and I went back to rushing the chair. What do you hear from Sam? Mr. Heron said. Nothing, Father said. I knew he didn't want to talk about Sam, but he couldn't be rude to Mr. Heron. He never writes? No. They weren't paying any attention to me. I took a quick glance at Tom Morups. He was standing there holding his mug of beer, his face blank. I couldn't figure out which side he was on. He lived on Mr. Reed's land. Mr. Reed was a patriot. But he ran messages for Mr. Heron. Mr. Heron was a Tory. It's a shame about Sam, Mr. Heron said. My father shrugged, but didn't say anything. Mr. Heron must have known that Father didn't want to talk about Sam. But he said, perhaps there'd be a way of finding out where he is. If he wants to see us, he knows where we live. Mr. Heron nodded. Actually, I didn't come to talk about Sam. I'm going to talk about Tim. I have a little job I thought Tim might do for me. I need a boy to walk down to Fairfield for me. I watched Father's face. His eyes got narrow, and he stared straight ahead. Why a boy, Mr. Heron? What's wrong with Tom? Heron shrugged. Pretty hard for a strange Indian to walk down there without getting stopped every 5 miles. Nobody's going to bother a boy. It was a scary idea, but exciting. It would be a real adventure. But of course I knew that I wasn't supposed to have any opinion in the matter, so I kept my mouth shut. What's he going to be carrying? Father said. Oh, just some business letters, Mr. Heron said casually. Nothing important. Father said nothing, but stared down into his beer. Mr. Heron took a drink. Then he said, There's no danger. Life, nobody's going to bother a boy. Business letters? Father said. Yes, business letters. I couldn't keep my mouth shut any longer. I can do it, Father. I can walk down there tomorrow morning and be back by supper time. Be quiet, Tim. I'd pay him a shilling. My father stared into his beer again, and then slowly he began to shake his head. No, Mr. Heron, he said. No, I've got one mixed up in this bloody war already. I'm not going to let the other one go. Mr. Heron paused before he spoke. I said they were business letters, Life. Business letters. Father stared at him. No, Mr. Heron. No. When Father said no, he meant no. It disappointed me. It would have been a good adventure walking down to Fairfield on my own. It was on Long Island Sound. I'd only been there 2 or 3 times in my life when I'd gone down with Father and Sam to buy rum. Carrying letters to Fairfield would give me something to boast about to Sam. But Father had said no. That was it. And Mr. Heron knew it. Mr. Heron finished his beer and stood up. I had more faith in you than that, Life, he said. I thought I could count on you. We're all making sacrifices these days.